Good morning, students. Today we will be going through the topic of biomechanics of shoulder complex, keeping in mind the kinetics and the kinematics of each joint. Now we will be covering this topic under the heading of sternoclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint, scapulothoracic joint, glenohumeral joint, scapulohumeral rhythm, and stabilizers of shoulder. Today we will be covering the first joint, that is the sternoclavicular joint. Now why this shoulder is called a shoulder complex and not a shoulder joint? The reason is it has got 20 muscle attachments to it. It has got 3 bony structures. We know that 3 joints, which is the sternoclavicle, as we have shown here, the sternoclavicular joint, the acromioclavicular joint, the glenohumeral joint. But it has also got 3 soft tissue surfaces which also play a very important role in the shoulder complex and during its function, which 2 of them are the functional joint, which we say as suprahumeral space and scapulothoracic joint, and one structure is called as bicipital groove. These play a very important role during the function of shoulder complex. Now basically shoulder complex is designed for mobility. You can move this shoulder complex or shoulder joint in all the directions. Fine. So it is more for mobility than for stability. So it is said to be an incongruent joint. Fine. Now it is made up of 3 bones, the scapula, the clavicle, as well as the humerus. And it is the link, it basically links the upper extremity to thorax via the axial skeleton. So it's a ball and socket variety of a synovial joint. So here you can see the 3 anatomical and 2 functional joints. I have tried to show you over here. That is the sternoclavicular joint, the acromioclavicular joint, the suprahumeral articulation, the bicipital groove, the glenohumeral joint, and the subscapulothoracic articulation. Fine. The function of shoulder complex. Now the basic function of shoulder complex is it acts as a stabilizer for hand function. Now I have to lift this. So it is, the shoulder is acting as a stabilizer for any of my hand function. Now it is responsible for pulling an object or pushing an object. It is helpful during inspiration, forced inspiration and expiration. And it is also used in weight bearing, in a close kinetic chain exercises of upper limb. It is responsible for weight bearing and during, of course, handstand. Fine. Now let us start with the sternoclavicular joint. Now my way of learning or teaching biomechanics is I divide the topic into major headings. Now each joint need to be written in under 5 headings. What is the type of the joint you have? What is the degree of freedom it has? What is the articular structures or the articular surfaces? What are the accessory structures involved? And the last is the 5th point is the motions, that is the osteo and the arthrokinematics. Fine. I describe any joint under 5 headings and it helps me to explain also well as well as write in the paper also well. So I expect you guys to write in this form. Like it is a plain variety of a synovial joint. Now if you can see, this is a joint which is made between the, the clavicle as well as the manubrum sterni. Fine. So it is a joint which is formed between the medial end of the clavicle as well as the sternum. Now if you can see this surface is not smooth or flat. Fine. And it is basically, I wanted to show you that this surface is concave and convex, but it is in a minimum form. So only the inferior portion, if you can see, the antero-inferior portion of it is attached to the manubrum sterni. The superior posterior portion is free, actually free. It is not attached to the manubrum sterni. So only the inferior portion is attached to the manubrum sterna, and in manubrum sterna there is a clavicular facet. The clavicle facet is there and on which this is attached. So if you can see, it is given this, that is why it is given a plain kind of a synovial joint type of a variety. Why so? Though it is having a concavo-convex shape, a saddle shape, but since only one part of it is responsible for the articulation of this joint, as is working as an articular surface of the joint, therefore we consider it as a plane variety of a synovial joint, whereas the concavo-convex rules will be used when we will learn about the kinetics and the kinematics, or the osteo and the arthrokinematics of the joint. Fine. So you understand why it is a plain synovial joint. Plain synovial joint because the anterior portion of this medial end of the clavicle, if you can see for yourself, the medial end of the clavicle is only responsible for the articulation with the manibrum sterni. As a whole part of the medial end of the clavicle is not a part of articulation. So that is why it is an incongruent joint. It is a incongruent joint. Now what is the degree of freedom? The degree of freedom is 3 translatory degree and 3 rotatory motions. Now translatory motion is the motion which is between the manibrum and the medial end of the clavicle. Now if these motions are very minute, very small amount, these motions are the superior and inferior motion, that is the superior movement, the inferior movement, the medial movement, the lateral movement, the anterior movement and the posterior movement. So you can see for yourself, superior, inferior, medial, lateral, anterior and posterior movements. These are the 3 degree of translatory movement which are possible at, and they are in very small amount. So but it is present, and we will be learning about this joint movement later on. And that is called 3 rotatory movements. The rotatory movements is elevation, depression, protraction, retraction and rotation, and that is the posterorotation and anterior rotation. Fine, there are 3 rotatory and 3 translatory movements. Now we have got various accessory structures also. Since we come to know that this is a kind of an incongruent joint, so to make it more stable, it will require accessory structures. The most important part of this accessory structure is the disc. I'll say the disc. That is, it is a fibrocartilaginous structure or a disc which basically helps to increase the congruence of the joint. Now disc is basically it is a fibrocartilage structure which is attached on this is the superior part of the medial end of the clavicle, and it is attached to the manibrum and the first costal cartilage. So the disc it's a diagonal shaped structure whose upper portion is attached to the posterior superior part of the medial end of the clavicle, and it is attached to the manibrum sterni. And if I can show you the picture, now you see this is this portion is responsible for formation of the joint. The upper portion, that is the posterior superior part, is not the part of the joint. Only this much part, that is the inferior anterior part, is getting attached to the medial or the clavicle facet of the manibrum sterni. So this is the part. Now the disc is arising from the, if you can see, the superior posterior part and getting attached to the manibrum as well as the first rib. Manibrum and the first rib. It is a diagonal shaped fibrocartilaginous structure and which divides this cavity into 2 halves. This disc has got a very important role in movement, because this disc is giving increasing the congruence, it is increasing the stability. It is also responsible for dissipating the forces, which the forces from the lateral end or from the shoulder when in a closed kinematic chain, the medial dissipating forces, that is, which is when there is a medial translatory forces, it helps to dissipate that forces so that there is no dislocation at the medial end of the clavicle. And the third important function of this disc is in motion. Now this disc, since it is diagonally attached, it is responsible for, now it acts as a pivot. So this is attached like this. It acts as a pivot in elevation and depression movement. This is elevation and this is depression movement. So the disc is a part of the manibrum. It becomes a part of the manibrum. It is attached like this, and you can see that the clavicle is getting elevated. So basically it becomes a part of the manibrum. It acts as a pivot for the motion of elevation and depression. But what happens in protraction and retraction, this disc act as along with the clavicle and help in restricting the motion. It helps in the restriction of protraction and retraction, and therefore it plays a very important role in motion. So it is important for the stability. It is also responsible for the motion, and it is also responsible for the dissipation of forces. Fine. And you can see this articular disc. Can you see the diagonal shape of it and how it is dividing it into two cavities? It is arising from the posterior part and it is going to the inferior anterior part and getting inserted at the first rib and the manubrum. Fine. You can see for this. Then this disc is playing a very crucial role in the motion also. Now coming to the disc, after this we have certain movement, point as the joint capsule. It is also very strong, and this strong capsule is there and it is superimposed by ligaments. Here ligaments play a very crucial role. Now it has got these three ligaments which you can see for yourself. The first ligament is the ligament between the manubrum, that is the sternal, as well as the clavicle. The sternum and the clavicle, therefore the name is given as sternoclavicular ligament. The first is the sternoclavicular ligament. As you can see for yourself over here, this ligament has got two important fibers, that is the anterior the sternoclavicular ligament and the posterior sternoclavicular ligament. Now the anterior sternoclavicular ligament and the posterior sternoclavicular ligament, they will help to prevent the anterior translation and the posterior translation of the medial end of the clavicle. So it prevents the anterior sternoclavicular ligament, will prevent the anterior and the posterior translation of the medial end of the clavicle. The second ligament is this is the first rib and this is the clavicle. You can see this green image. The first one was the brown image. The second is the green image. If you can see for yourself, the second is the costoclavicular ligament. This costoclavicular ligament is arising from the first rib and going up to the clavicle. It has got two laminas and it has got anterior and posterior lamina. The anterior lamina basically runs, posteriorly, laterally. The anterior lamina runs laterally. This is the anterior lamina and it is running laterally, whereas the posterior lamina runs medially. So it forms like a cross-like structure. If I have an image, no, it is a cross-like structure, and this is very much responsible for controlling the rotational movement of the clavicle. When there is a rotational upward and downward rotational movement of the clavicle, it is controlled by the costoclavicular ligament, and as well as all the motions of these clavicle is controlled by, it is a very strong ligament, costoclavicular ligament, and it plays a very important role in joint stabilization when the movement is taking place, because the stability of the joint is very much required when the motion is taking place. Fine. Then there is something called interclavicular ligament. In this, this is the only horizontal bone which is present in our body, and this bone need to be connected with the other bone also, so that it maintains this horizontal position. So there is an interclavicular ligament, and this plays a very important role in maintaining the horizontal position of the clavicle, and as well as it also gets taut and it limits the motion when the clavicle, medial end of the clavicle is moving, or the sternoclavicular joint is in motion. So it also plays in the stability. So these three ligaments plays a very crucial role in the stability. We will discuss about it in detail when we will study about the kinetics and the kinematics of the SC joint. Fine. Now what we have studied till now is the articular surfaces. We know that the articular surface is incongruent. It is a incongruent kind of a joint, since the anterior inferior part of the medial end of the clavicle is only articulating with the clavicle facet of the manubrum sterni. Fine. So it is the incongruent kind of a joint, and that is why though it is having a concavo-convex shape, but we say it as a plane synovial joint, because the concavo-convex shape is very much minimum. It has got 3 degrees of motion, 3 translatory and 3 rotatory degree. The translatory degree is anterior and posterior, superior and inferior, and medial and lateral movement. Fine. Rotatory movements are elevation and depression, protraction and retraction, and upward and downward rotation. It has got therefore accessory structures. It look for those accessory structures. These accessory structures are the joint disc. This joint disc plays a very crucial role in the stability of the joint. Then the joint capsule and its three ligaments. The three ligaments are the sternoclavicular ligaments, the costoclavicular ligaments and the interclavicular ligaments. Is this clear? With this images, this is for the articular surface. You can see the concavo-convex shape. Okay, this way we will be using this concavo-convex shape. It is very important when we will learn about the osteo and the arthrokinematics. And if you can see, this is the clavicle, this is the first rib, this is the manubrium sterni, this is the interclavicular ligament, and this is the articular disc. Fine. And these are the three ligaments. The yellow one is the interclavicular ligament, the red one is the interior sternoclavicular ligament, and similarly it has a posterior sternoclavicular ligament. Then the green one is the costoclavicular ligament having two laminas, the anterolateral and posteromedial lamina. Fine. Now what is this role of this clavicle? Now it becomes a site of muscle attachment. It is a site of muscle attachment for trapezius, sternocleidomastoid, deltoid, pectoralis major, clavicular fiber. Fine. It is a barrier for underlying structures. With this clavicle play a very crucial role because it protects the brachial plexus, because you know that a bunch of nerves are passing under it, so it becomes a barrier for the and a protector for the brachial plexus group of muscle, brachial plexus itself. Third is it acts as a strut to stabilize shoulder. It plays a very crucial role in the shoulder mobility. When the shoulder mobility, we will be discussing about the shoulder movement in scapulohumeral rhythm. We will see how it acts as an important role. It holds and acts as a stabilizer for the shoulder also. And it also prevents the medial displacement and inferior migration of the shoulder. So this is a horizontal bone and it prevents the shoulder, the inferior gliding as well as the medial displacement of the shoulder girdle itself. Fine. Now, before we start with the osteo and the arthrokinematics, you should be very much aware of these planes. You are well aware of this transverse plane, and this is the vertical axis. This is the sagittal plane, fine, and this is the frontal plane and coronal axis, fine. Now, you have to be very much clear about two rules also. Concavo-convex rule. What is concavo-convex rule is, when a concave surface is moving on a convex, when a concave surface is moving on a stable convex bone, that means the movement will be in the direction of the bone. That is, the joint movement will be in the direction of the bone. In other words, if I can say, if the bone movement we say it as osteokinematics, and the joint movement we say it as arthrokinematics, that is the movement, intra-articular movement is called as arthrokinematics and extra-articular movement is called as osteokinematics, then we can say that in concavo-convex position, when the concave surface is moving on a convex bone, we say that the arthrokinematics is same as osteokinematics, that is the movement inside the joint will be same as that of the bone. Whereas it is when the convex surface is moving on a stable concave part, you see that the movement of the bone or inside the joint, the intra-articular movement is away or opposite to that of the stable joint. That is, the osteokinematics is different, or the arthrokinematics is opposite to that of the osteokinematics. Now, if we are fine with this kind of a revision, we will start with the motion. So we know that there are elevation and depression. That means if this is a bone, we see that there is an elevation and depression, where this elevation and depression takes place in frontal plane and in AP axis. Then there is a protraction and retraction which takes place in transverse plane and vertical axis, and there is an anterior and posterior rotation which takes place in longitudinal axis. The axis is longitudinal. Fine. Now, if we see the SC joint axis, it just lies in just lateral to the joint and near to the costoclavicular ligament. The costoclavicular, you have seen the costoclavicular ligament, it just lies lateral to the joint near to the costoclavicular ligament. So the location of this functional axis far from the joint reflects a large intra-articular motion of the medial end of the clavicle. Now you understand why this motion is very much important is, since the SC joint axis is lying away from the joint itself and towards the costo-clavicular ligament, so there is a large intra-articular motion, that is large arthrokinematics which is going on, motion which is going on at the level of the medial clavicle. Now this motion is I've tried to show you through bone also, but here in the image you can see the protraction and retraction, that is the elevation and depression, and the rotational, posterior rotation. Fine, this is the bone and you can see the posterior rotation of the bone. Fine, and this is the elevation and depression of the motion. Now, for understanding, whenever you write the first motion, or we will study about the elevation and depression, you need to define the motion. Now you understand this as, this is the bone. Now we take as a reference point, we take reference point as the lateral end of the clavicle. The lateral end of the clavicle is taken as the reference point. So we define the motion. Elevation is when the lateral end of the clavicle moves upward. This motion is said to be an elevation motion. When the lateral end of the clavicle moves downwards, this is called as the depression movement. So first you need to define this movement, elevation and depression. Then you need to tell me about the degree of motion. The degree of motion which is taking place is, the elevation is roundabout going up to 50 degree, whereas depression is going up to 10 degree. So you have to tell me the degree at which the motion is taking place. Next you need to tell me about, this is about the bony motion. Now you have to tell me about the arthro motion. Now in this case we are taking reference point as the lateral end of the clavicle. Here and you see the elevation and depression, the convex part of the clavicle, moves on the stable concave part of the mandibular. Here we are following a convexo-concave rule. Now what happens is that there is a large intra-articular motion also which is taking place. Now when the lateral end of the clavicle moves upwards, it moves superiorly, and it moves superiorly, there will be an inferior movement at the medial end of the clavicle. Now you understand, because the arthrokinematics is opposite to that of the osteokinematics. The osteokinematics shows that the lateral end of the clavicle moves upwards superiorly, and the medial end of the clavicle will move inferiorly. It will move inferiorly. It will roll inferiorly. Fine, this is the movement which takes place. Okay? The movement which takes place is this. Fine, that means it will be opposite to that of the lateral end. Fine, this is a very important movement. Now if this kind of a movement is taking place, if this is a movement which is taking place, so there will be certain ligaments which will be restricting these motions. That means, if you can see for yourself, the first is the costo-clavicular ligament. The first is the costo-clavicular ligament is taut. As soon as this movement takes place, the costo-clavicular ligament is taut and it will try to restrict this movement. Whereas the interclavicular ligament, as the ligament, and the interior sternoclavicular ligament, they are relaxed. They are basically relaxed. Even the subscapularis muscle is also taut and it prevents the elevation of movement. Fine. So you need to write these, what muscles and ligaments are stabilizing this movement, and then you need to tell me all the muscles which are responsible for this elevation. Now the muscles of elevations are basically the upper fibers of the trapeze. Fine, it is responsible for this movement. So you need to tell me about this movement. Now coming to the depression. Now what is depression? We have to define the depression. Depression is when the lateral end of the clavicle move downwards. Okay? What will happen at the medial end? The medial end of the clavicle will move or will glide upwards, that is superiorly. It will move, the lateral end of the clavicle is moving inferiorly, whereas the medial end of the clavicle will move superiorly. Now if it is moving superiorly, you see the costoclavicular ligament is relaxed, whereas the interclavicular ligament and the interior portion, or both the portion of sternoclavicular ligaments, are taut. Both the lamina of sternoclavicular ligament are taut. Fine. So you need to tell me the structures which are stabilizing it and the structures which are responsible for these movement, the range of movement and everything. Fine. Now the important over here is the role of disc. As I told you, in elevation and depression, this kind of a movement, the disc plays a very crucial role. It becomes, the movement takes place on a disc, that is, it acts as a pivot. It works along with the sternum and it acts as a pivot on which this movement takes place, the elevation and depression. In elevation and depression, the medial end of the clavicle rolls and slides over stationary disc with upper attachment of the disc serving as a pivot. The disc is considered a part of manubrium in elevation and depression. Is the topic clear? Now let us come to the second part, the second movement, protraction and retraction. Now again the reference point will be the same. The reference point will be the lateral end of the clavicle. So we will define first the protraction. The protraction is when the lateral end of the clavicle moves anteriorly. The lateral end of the clavicle moves anteriorly. Whereas retraction is when the lateral end of the clavicle moves posteriorly. Now herein the concave part of the clavicle, now this is a convex part. If you can see it properly, this is a convex part and this is a concave part. The concave part of the clavicle moves on a convex part of the manubrium sterni. Here osteokinematics is same as arthrokinematics, or in other words the arthrokinematics is same as the osteokinematics. Fine. Herein, if the movement is of the lateral end of the clavicle is moving anteriorly, the medial end of the clavicle is also moving anteriorly, or the medial glide is also anteriorly. Fine. The movement over here is protraction to retraction. That is, if the lateral end of the clavicle is moving posteriorly, the medial end of the clavicle is also moving or rolling and sliding posterior. Fine. When this movement is taking place, you need to tell about the muscles which are taut. Again, during retraction, I have tried to show you over here the retraction, the costoclavicular ligament. You can see for yourself. Here is costoclavicular ligament. Now, the moment this is there, the costoclavicular ligament is taut, totally taut, and the interior sternoclavicular ligament is also taut, whereas the posterior sternoclavicular ligament will be relaxed. Okay? So this is costoclavicle, anterior and posterior. You need to tell me all those ligaments which are working as stabilizers. Fine. Now in protraction and retraction of clavicle, the SC disc plays a very crucial role because the medial clavicle rolls and slides together with the manubrium facet, where lower attachment of the disc act as a pivot and the disc therefore becomes a part of the clavicle. Now herein the lower end of the disc becomes a part, and therefore it takes part of the clavicle. There, initially the upper end was working, now the lower end, which was attached to the manubrium facet and the first rib, becomes a part of the movement of the clavicle. So it is, the disc is acting along with the clavicle here in protraction and retraction. Now there is another movement which is there along with the longitudinal axis, that is called as the anterior and the posterior rotation. Now ideally there is no if you can see this clavicle, there is only this movement. If you can see, this is the inferior part and this is the superior part. Now if this is the motion, so this is the movement which is happening. Fine. Where you can see the rotational movement. You see for yourself. This is the movement. Now this movement is this movement taking place when you are able to see the inferior structure. Fine. That is, this is the movement which is possible. Now if this is the movement which is possible, which is called as the posterior rotation or downward rotation, and this is called as the anterior rotation or the neutral movement. Now this is the idle movement which is happening, and this is the posterior rotation or downward rotation, and coming back to the neutral position is said to be the interior rotation or upward rotation. So these are the two movements which are possible, and in this. Fine. And this is along with the spinning movement. It is the spinning of the long bone itself. Now how you will write, I want to summarize this kinetics and kinematics which I have explained so long to you. This you need to summarize it in a table. And if you can see this table, I have given the heading of motions axis and plane in which the motion is taking place. What is the osteokinematics? What is the arthrokinematics of it? What the structures limiting the motion and the muscle work. Can you see? For elevation, the degree of elevation should be 0 to 50 degree. It is working at AP axis and frontal plane. The lateral end of the clavicle is basically rolling superiorly and upwards, whereas the medial end is gliding inferiorly, and where the disc is acting as a pivot. Fine, it is limited by costoclavicular ligament and the subscapularis muscle, and it has been basically muscle work of levator scapulae, trapeze, upper fibers and rhomboids. They come into play, or the muscle contract during the elevation motion. Whereas in depression, it is 0 to 15 degree of depression takes place. It is at AP axis at frontal plane. The lateral end of the clavicle moves, rolls downwards and inferiorly. The medial end glides superiorly. SC ligament and IC ligaments are, that is sternoclavicular ligaments and interclavicular ligament is limits this motion, and the motion is produced by pectoralis minor, trapeze, lower fibers and serratus anterior muscle. The protraction is only 15 to 20 degree, guys, and it takes place in vertical axis and transverse plane, where the lateral end moves anteriorly, whereas the medial end rolls and glides also anteriorly. Fine. It has been limited by the posterior fibers of the sternoclavicular ligament and the costoclavicular ligament, and the muscle which produce this motion is pectoralis major and serratus anterior. Retraction is 30 degrees. It acts on a vertical axis and transverse plane, where the lateral end of the clavicle moves posteriorly and the medial ends rolls and glides posteriorly. The ligaments which are taut or which helps in stabilizing the joint is the costoclavicular ligament, the interior fibers of sternoclavicular ligament and the interclavicular ligament. The muscle which work is trapezius muscle, latissimus dorsi muscle and rhomboids. Anterior rotation is also called as the downward rotation, is only 10 degree. It happens along with the long axis of the clavicle, and the clavicle rotates to neutral position. I told you there is a rotation. It comes back to the neutral position, is called as a anterior rotation, where there is a spinning motion which takes place at the medial end of the clavicle. It has been controlled by the costoclavicular ligament, and levator scapulae, latissimus dorsi, pectoralis minor and rhomboids play a role in muscle work. Whereas the posterior rotation which takes place is this posterior rotation, if you can see. This takes place is the upward rotation, which is 50 degree, and the clavicle rotates posteriorly, and there is a spinning movement at the medial end of the clavicle. Costoclavicular ligaments limits this motion, and upper fibers of the trapezius along with the lower fibers and serratus anterior results in the movement of this joint. Fine, or movement of the posterior rotation of the SC joint. So this is how you will describe the kinetics and the kinematics of SC joint. Now tomorrow I am going to start with the other parts, and maybe we will be doing it more quickly. That is, I will be starting with the acromioclavicular joint and the scapulothoracic joint. I will cover two joints together, because today I wanted to introduce you with the topic of shoulder complex itself first, and then start with one joint, and so that you understand how we have to write about the kinetics and the kinematics of the joint. I have to describe you the motions of the joints. Fine, and I hope you understand this topic, and you will be able to go in depth about how the movements takes place in this SC joint. Thank you guys.